Views, elevations. Here we are in our model that we've worked on so far. We're going to be looking at how we can use elevations, how we can make elevations, and a few tips and tricks and best practices as to how to use them best in the context of this project. I'm going to double click on top of floor 1, and this is in the project browser, the left-hand side. Now let's just zoom out. I'm going to roll my scroll wheel back, then I'm going to press it down and drag my mouse over just so I can pan. You can see that there's these objects. These objects are elevation markers. Now they're not filled out. They have not been dropped onto sheets yet, but they are elevation markers. For instance, this one right here, if I were just to hover over that triangle, it's the arrow, it says Views Elevation South. So why don't I go to that corresponding view in my project browser under Elevations, and then South, and I'll just double click on that. Okay, so now we're looking at it from that vantage point. I'm just going to close down that view, bring us back to our plan view again. What if I look at it from this vantage point, Views Elevation North? Now, instead of clicking on North under the Elevations category in the project browser, I'm just going to double click on the arrow. And now I can see, yes, there's my north elevation, so I'm looking from the north. There's the opening symbol on the window. Let me hit the X on that view and we'll go right back to our plan view. So how are these made and how are these adjusted? Let's talk first of all about how to adjust these elevation markers. So if I were to just select the elevation marker like this, you'll notice that it's picked up two objects. Now if I click off it and I click on the first object, sometimes it's referred to as the bubble, and it's the elevation, building elevation family. Now, what if I were to click on the triangle? Well, it's also part of the same object, but it's a secondary piece of it. You'll notice another thing happens when you click on that little triangle. You're going to get this line here. And you know what that line is? That's the line at which the elevation is being taken. So what this view is doing is saying, okay, starting here and looking that way, show me the building. Now, if I were to click on this object here, it can be moved independently. What if I were to drag that into the building? Now, let's double click on the north elevation. Notice what's happened is it's actually cutting into the building. It's acting like a section. So that's something you've got to watch for with the elevations. I'm going to hit the X. To get the truest elevation possible, click on the elevation arrow and just click and drag that blue line out past the front face of the building if that's where you want the elevation to be taken. Even past where there would be an overhang because we want to see what's on the overhang. Now if I double click on this little arrow here, this Views Elevation North arrow, now I can see the building again in elevation. But what if we want to do interior elevations? Let's close down that view and back to our plan view. Well, you can make both interior and exterior elevations with the same tool, just a different family. So if I go to View, and I'm going to go to Elevation, notice here there's a little drop-down arrow. That is indicating that there's a little bit more information for you to get there. So I'm just going to drop that down, and I'm going to pick Elevation. I wouldn't recommend that you use framing elevations in this particular instance. We're going to just use Elevation. So it's just the one tool. Now, before we start drawing the elevation, before we click the point, let's go into the Properties palette and the Type selector, and we can choose either a building elevation or an interior elevation. Now, a building elevation is meant to be exterior. An interior elevation is meant to be interior. So if I were to just click on Interior Elevation, now what I'm going to do here is just drop that in. Good. Now I'm going to hit Escape twice. That'll just take me out of that command. Now you'll notice that it's made a little elevation bubble, and it's actually a round bubble, and it has a dark arrow. So it looks a little bit different from the exterior or building elevations. The other thing you'll notice about this is if I drop down the project browser, there's now a heading here called Elevations Interior Elevation. So if I double click on that, you'll notice that Elevation 1A, that's what this is. It corresponds to this right here. So if I just double click on that, now it's looking at this wall from the inside. I'm going to click on the X and close that view. Now let's make sure by clicking on the arrow that the line is showing us the right place. So what it's doing is it's saying, let's start here and look that way. Anything that's in that viewing plane will be our elevation. And so far, I think that's just a fine way to do it. Important best practice is to always name your views. Just something logical. It doesn't have to be very elaborate or long. In fact, try to keep the name short, but just name them something. I'm going to click onto the view in the project browser and just right click on it. And then I'm going to click on rename. Now the heading is already elevations, interior elevations. So why don't I just call this one north wall? Now if I were to click on the bubble again, notice what happens. I get all these other elevations that pop up. Let's try clicking on all 4 of those and see what happens. Notice what's happening here? It's creating all 4 elevations for those directions. Now that can be just fine to do things like that. There's a slight risk though that if you do need to put these bubbles on different sheets, you may need to have a new elevation bubble just for that particular one. In this case though, we're fine just to leave them in this format. So what are we going to do? Well, it's always a best practice to rename each of these views. So how do we know which one is which? Well, we can see on screen here that this is elevation 1D. But if you don't have this, like in the case of building elevations, you can click on the elevation arrow, and in the properties palette, you just scroll down, you'll see there's the view name. And I can rename it there. So I could call that one west wall because it's looking at the west wall. And then maybe I want to go to this one. This is going to be east wall. We can apply that. And then we can go to that one right there, and that will be south wall. And we'll apply that. Now we look at this marker and we can see that, wow, it's really cluttered. It really is cluttered. All the things are kind of crashing into each other. And that is a function of the family. So that's something that we'll look at in later videos, how to adjust annotation family, like section bubbles, elevation bubbles, and other things like that. For now, though, we're just going to go with this, and we'll clean that up later. Now, what happens when you double-click on these views? Well, it takes you to just the interior view. For now, it doesn't look like much, but as we get working, these are going to fill out with more and more information. Every view has a scale, and in the case of this view right here, this is our top of floor 1 view. Right now, the view scale is set to 1/8. Let's just set that to something else. Let's click on that button. I'm going to set the view scale to, how about we try 1/4 inch to the foot? And I'll just zoom in. You'll notice now it shrunk down our annotation, and it made it just a little bit more accessible for us to see that. And remember, this scale factor will change its size on the sheet. So for now, this is purely so we can work comfortably. We may even want to go as far as 1/2 inch to the foot for now. And then that'll just give us a good overall view of what we're working on, and yet none of the annotation is too big and overwhelming.